Be sure to hit record today. Okay, so just a couple of quick things. Today we're going to go over chapter 23. There is a lab assignment. It's due at the end of the week. It's going to be on the heart and pulse, and checking your pulse and checking your blood pressure. So we'll be going through some information about that today during the lecture. Um, Tomorrow I will be doing a formal overview during lab time of what I expect on the paper and the presentation, and I'll also be probably today sending a Google document with um, time slots for you to be signing up for your presentations. Okay, so you do remember there is a presentation component um, for your projects. Okay. And again, if you're having any issues, I'm going to have office hours right after this. So please just come in and, or even if you're not able to make office hours, schedule a time to meet with me. Okay. I'm always open to meet with you outside of those office hours. Okay. I feel like many students don't even attend the office hours. I only get a couple that trickle in every now and then. So if you're not able to come, or if you're not able to attend, set up a time where you can meet with me or a different time. Okay. That works for you. All right. 'Cause it seems like there's a lot of students that feel left out or left in the dark. Um, and I'm here to, help you with that. So if you make yourself available, I'll make myself available. So please be thinking about that. And if you haven't chosen a topic or haven't started researching, I would start doing that ASAP, because we're a little bit past the midway point through the semester. So it's time to start buckling down. We do have an exam schedule for next week, so I'll probably schedule that on the Thursday, and you'll have till that weekend on Saturday to finish. Um, so just be sure to be studying, okay? And it's going to be on chapters 16 through 23. So today's chapter will definitely be on the exam for next week. Okay, so you have the 5 chapters again. Okay, 16, 17, 21, 22, and 23. Okay, um, yeah. So just be ready. Okay. Oops. All right. Circulation and respiration. All right. Unifying concepts of animal circulation. Oops. So the circulatory system, this is the organ system that transports materials such as nutrients, oxygen, and hormones to body cells, and transports CO2 and other waste from body cells. Okay. So the circulatory system essentially includes your heart and the connective tissue known as blood. Okay. And again, blood is going to be the red cells, plasma, white cells. We have platelets. We have different dissolved blood components too. Okay. But we won't get into too much detail about that. We will talk about a little bit about red cells, and we'll get to white cells later when we talk about immune responses. Okay. So we have 2 types of circulatory systems that we're going to be talking about. We have an open circulatory system. So this is a circulatory system in which the circulating fluid, if that's a typo, the circulating fluid is pumped through open vessels and out among the body cells. In an animal with an open circulatory system, the circulating fluid and intersagittal fluid are the same. Okay, what this means is that your blood, the blood of these types of animals, is going to be essentially bathing the entire cells, all of their cells. And this is typically associated with primitive circulatory systems or primitive life. Okay, so think of maybe a bivalve or a clam, something that's very, very small, something that is not developed in terms of how large they are. And a closed circulatory system is just going to be much more efficient. Okay, whereas an open circulatory system is kind of mixing everything together and just trying to disperse the oxygen systemically throughout that body in the quickest way possible. Okay. Whereas a closed circulatory system, again, is going to be much more refined. It's going to be much more efficient. Okay. Um, so closed circulatory system, in which blood is confined to vessels and is kept separate from the intersagittal fluid. And we'll kind of see those variations right now when we go through um, the circulatory systems. Okay, so again, we have an open versus a closed circulatory system here. Um, an open system, again, like in this crab or mollusks, right, or bivalves, so those clams. So fluid is pumped through open-ended tubes, allowing for intersagittal fluid to flow among cells. So you have a heart that pumps the intersagittal fluid. Again, this is going to be bathing the organ systems and cells. Okay, so there's no real capillary bed. So we have capillaries in us, right, that we cut. If we cut, you see the blood kind of oozing out, and those capillary beds are important for gas exchange, right? That's going to be at the cellular level. Whereas this, the fluid is going to be passing over the different cells um, uh, as the blood travels through the body or through their body. Okay, there's not going to be capillaries. There's not going to be a real gas exchange. It's just the whatever the cellular fluid is what's going to be considered blood as well. Okay, whereas here we keep our different body compartments separate away from blood, right? And you can think of this in terms of when you cut into a human or a person during surgery, right? If you cut and you open, you look at the organs, you see that there's really no blood spilling over. Okay. Let's say if you nick an artery, you nick a blood vessel, that's when you have the blood spilling into the cavity, whether it be the visceral or peritoneum, pericardium, right? There's different cavities that are kept separate away from blood. Okay. Whereas here in a crab or a mollusk with an open circulatory system, that blood is just going to be covering all their cells and all their tissue without any vascular tissue present, right? They're not going to really have veins or arteries. It's all going to be just one continuous fluid, right? Whereas we keep oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood separate through arteries and veins, okay? So it's a little bit different. No, it's actually a lot different. So a closed system, there's two different types of systems. We carry a central pump, right? Our heart. It's a four-chambered heart, which means it has four different directionalities of which it can go into, right? You have to and from, essentially. And we'll go over those different directions or those reasons why it goes to and from in a minute. Okay. The single circulatory system um, with one directionality, so a centralized pump, and it's going to have the body and the gills kind of one flow in one way, where the heart is going to be continuously pumping in one single direction. Right? Uh, um, there's no central system where there's an out and an ingoing chambers of the heart. Whereas we have that four chamber heart where we have blood coming in as well as going away at different times. Okay, um, so the single circulation system again is going to be pumping in one direction and getting fed in one direction. Okay. All right, unifying concepts of animal circulation. So the cardiovascular system is a closed circulatory system found in vertebrates with a heart and a branching network of arteries, capillaries, and veins. An artery is a vessel that carries blood away from the heart and other parts of the body. A capillary is a microscopic blood vessel that conveys blood between an artery and a vein or between an arteriole and a venule, enables the exchange of nutrients and dissolved gases between the blood and intersagittal fluid, right? So capillary beds are going to be essential for the off-gassing of the blood to different tissues, all right, or different organ systems, okay? And this is kind of important, right? You need this very thin or very small capillary system in order to get oxygen to those various components or various compartments of the body, right? A vein in animals is a vessel that returns blood to the heart. So we'll talk about artery and veins a little more detail in a bit, but just know that arteries are going to be any vessel going away from the heart. Okay, and typically they're going to be high pressure. So think high pressure with an artery. Veins are going to be any system that pumps blood to the heart. Okay, and typically they're going to be lower pressure. Okay, and we'll talk about the differences of each. And there are special arteries and there are special. Well, there is a special artery and there's a special vein that we'll kind of mention right now in terms of the directionality of the heart and where the blood is flowing. Okay. All right, so circulating system is a circulation scheme where blood flows through the heart by way of a single closed loop or circuit, right? And this is going to be found in a fish, that whale shark that we saw in that image, right? It's going to be continuous flow. So this is important with with fish, especially because they do have something called the counter current exchange. So the way we have our lungs set up is where we take in a big breath. We have a tidal volume, right? We take a one, our diaphragm contracts, pulls down, opens our lungs up. We take a deep breath in, and then we have blood that's pumped to the lungs that's able to exchange gas, right? Fish or sharks have a different type of circulatory system where they pump blood to the gills in the opposite direction. So it's counter current exchange. So as soon as the water that has the most oxygen hits, it's going to go slowly down the lungs, or it's going to move over it's going to move over the gills, and the higher concentration of oxygen water is going to initially take the highest concentration of blood oxygen, right? So this is going to efficiently remove the oxygen away from the water, okay, which is necessary for a fish, okay, or a shark. Double circulation system, the circulation scheme where blood flows through the heart by way of two separate loops, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And again, this is because we contain our lungs within our bodies, and we have a specific tidal volume that we are able to fill. Okay, so um, it's just specific to land mammals and land organisms. Okay, pulmonary circuit, one of two main blood circuits in terrestrial vertebrates, conveys blood between the heart and the lungs. And the systemic circuit is one of two main blood circuits in terrestrial vertebrates, convey blood between the heart and the rest of the body. Okay. One thing to note between this single circulating system and the double circulation system is that this is a big step from leaving the ocean to coming into land, right? So frogs have a very interesting system as well because they have a three-chambered heart, but they do have components similar to the four-chamber heart in terms of they have a pulmonary system and they have a systemic circuit, right? So that blood is going to be going to the lungs and coming back from the lungs in the various atria. Again, two-chamber heart, and then those ventricles are going to be pumping blood kind of systemically as well. But again, that primitive heart means that the frogs or those amphibians do require moisture. They do require their skin to be wet because they have the ability to gas exchange through their skin. Okay, so not only do they have a heart and a pulmonary system and a circulatory system, but they also have an integument system or skin that's going to allow for them to transfer gases through their skin or through their tissues. Okay, so it's going to kind of help them out. Whereas we don't have that, right? We need to breathe in and out consistently in order to have gas exchange occur. So oxygen and CO2 being exchanged in our lungs. Okay, and we'll see the pulmonary and systemic circuit right now. So here we have the pulmonary circuit. Again, the pulmonary is referring to the lungs, right? So the pulmonary circuit is going to be showing you the right ventricle and the left atrium. Okay, so right ventricle, left atrium. So what happens is the left ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, right, through the pulmonary arteries. Okay, the pulmonary arteries, this uh, uh, artery here is going to be the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood. Okay, so the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. That's very important, right? And it's taking it to the lungs. Okay, and it comes back through the pulmonary veins. And guess what? The pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood back to the heart. And these are those two exceptions that I was talking about. In terms of the arteries here showing deoxygenated blood, and the veins here showing oxygenated blood. Okay, this goes to the top, right? The left atrium, and then eventually comes down to the left ventricle, which gets pumped systemically through the aorta. Okay, so here we have a systemic circuit, right? So this is a circuit that's going to be going systemically throughout the body, right? And it comes or incorporates the right ventricle and the left atrium. Right, so the left ventricle is going to receive or sorry, the right atrium is going to receive the blood systemically through superior and inferior vena cava from throughout the body, right? So this single chamber of the heart, the right atrium is going to be receiving all the blood from all the deoxygenated blood from everywhere in the body. Okay, whereas the left ventricle is going to be pumping blood, oxygenated blood through the whole body system, right? And this is going to be why the left ventricle is so much more muscular than the right ventricle, right? The right ventricle's job is only to pump blood to the heart or to the lungs, and the left ventricle's job is to pump blood to the whole body. Therefore, it does need to have a thicker muscular development, has more muscle tissue there in order to get that blood throughout the whole body, right? Or the right ventricle just needs a pump to the lungs. And again, the pulmonary circuit, think of this as only going from the heart to the lungs, right? Or the lungs back to the heart, okay? Whereas the systemic circuit is getting blood from the entire body or sending blood to the entire body, okay? And these are where these two chambers of the heart are connected. They either receive blood from the entire body or they're sending blood through the entire body, okay? All right, a long trip in a confined seat could wreak havoc with your cardiovascular system or your circulatory system. Um, and this is important because think of about a pulmonary embolism. And this is going to be like a clot that forms in your vasculature. And this is important, especially with individuals that are sitting for long periods of time or have poor circulation in general. Okay, so this is what they tell you if you're going on a flight to Europe or somewhere across the world, which you're probably not going to be doing anytime soon because of COVID. You should get up and walk around after every few hours on that flight. Right, and this is just to ensure that you don't have those the clotting of the blood or the pooling of the blood in your veins. Okay, and we'll talk about why that is right now. But the veins essentially are low pressure tubes that are going to be allowing the blood to come back, right? And they require your skeletal muscular system to actually help pump that blood back to the heart. Okay, because again, your veins are going to be low pressure, and this is also one of the reasons why individuals have varicose veins, right? They have a collapsing of that vein or the flaps in the vein, and you have the pooling of the blood within that vein system, right, or in the vasculature of those veins. Okay, and that's kind of important to know, right? You need to have extra help to get the blood in the veins back to the heart. Whereas the arteries, the left ventricle is going to be pumping high pressure blood throughout the whole body. But once it passes through the capillary beds, it loses the pressure. Okay, right? You don't want high pressure in those capillary beds because you could rupture those capillary beds essentially, right? So when it reaches those capillary beds, the pressure is pretty low, and then it goes back into the veins, and the veins need to have some sort of secondary mechanism to get that blood back to the heart. So they're low pressure. Okay. Um, yeah. So remember varicose veins, remember pulmonary embolism, or having to move or walk in order to um, get the blood back to the heart from the veins. All right. So there are three main components of the cardiovascular system. You have the pump, a vascular system, and a circulating fluid. Okay. So a pump, the heart vascular system is the vasculature, so the veins and arteries, and the circulating fluid, which is the blood, plasma, white cells, right? The essentially just the blood or the whole component of blood. Atrium is a heart chamber that receives blood from both body and the lungs via the veins. Ventricle is a heart chamber that pumps blood out of the heart to either the body or the lungs. Okay, so here we have the circulatory system kind of in a nutshell or a nice little summary. I know this seems confusing, but I'm going to run through each of the points right here twice. Okay, just so you have it on repeat if you want to review, and you do need to know this. Okay, so I'll probably be asking you to kind of detail the heart or the path of the blood through the heart for the exam next week. Okay, so the right atrium is going to receive blood from systemically from the body, right? So this is going to be a part of that systemic system, right? And you're getting blood from the superior and inferior vena cava, and it's going to be draining into that right atrium. That blood will then pump through this valve here, and then it's going to go into the right atrium. So this is called the tricuspid, but I'm not going to have you memorize. Well, yeah, because it's tricuspid and then bicuspid here, but um, yeah, you can know it. So the right atrium pumps blood, deoxygenated blood, mind you, through the tricuspid to the right ventricle. Okay, the right ventricle will then pump blood up into the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries will then be transferring the blood directly to the lungs. Okay, and then you have these alveolars here, alveoli tissue here, which then can have the off-gassing events. Right, it's very thin tissue, and this is where you're going to have the exchange of oxygen and CO2 and other waste products. Okay, so right through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and it's coming back through the pulmonary veins. Remember, the pulmonary artery is going to contain deoxygenated blood. So it'll be the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood, whereas a pulmonary vein is going to be the only vein that carries oxygenated blood back to the heart, to the chamber 6, which is the left atrium. Okay, the left atrium will then pump blood down to the left ventricle through the bicuspid. So this is a bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. That left ventricle will pump blood systemically throughout the body, right? So this is part of the systemic system as well. So the left ventricle will pump blood up into the aorta. The aorta will pump that high pressure blood throughout the whole body until it reaches the capillaries, right? Capillaries then will lower the pressure of that blood and then eventually pull into the inferior and superior vena cava, which will meet back at the right atrium. So again, you have the right atrium here. It's going to receive deoxygenated blood from the superior and inferior vena cava. That deoxygenated blood will travel through the tricuspid to the left or to the right ventricle. That right ventricle will pump deoxygenated blood through to the pulmonary artery, to the lungs. Again, this is going to contain deoxygenated blood, so the only artery that contains deoxygenated blood. This deoxygenated blood will then off gas and exchange gases in the lungs and the alveolar tissue. It will then be pumped back through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium. Okay, again, the left or the pulmonary veins are going to contain oxygenated blood. They're the only veins that contain oxygenated blood, and they're going to be pumping to the left atrium. That left atrium will pump oxygenated blood down through the bicuspid or the mitral valve to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then again is thicker, more muscular, will pump blood systemically through the aorta and through the various artery systems, which then will come back through the superior and inferior vena cava once they've off gassed at the capillary bed. Okay, so you do need to know these, I guess, 10, 11 little place cards here. So understand the blood and where it's going and why it's going there. Okay. All right, so how the heart works. So the heart is a chamber muscular organ in vertebrates that pumps blood received from the veins into the arteries, thereby maintaining the flow of blood through the entire circulatory system. The evolution of a powerful four-chamber heart was an essential adaptation to support high metabolic needs of birds, mammals, which are endothermic, right? And again, this four-chamber heart was necessary for land-dwelling animals, again, and developed animals, right? You cannot have an organism as large as an elephant without a four-chamber heart. It'd just be very, very difficult. So you need to have this higher level of development, higher level of circulation, higher level of efficiency present in these larger mammals that are endothermic, or larger organisms that are endothermic. And birds are very, very efficient. Birds are actually much more efficient than humans in terms of their pulmonary system. So when we talk about their lungs, okay, so much more efficient. All right. So blood flow through the human heart, and we kind of just went over this, but again, we have the right atrium that fills from the superior and inferior vena cava. You have the tricuspid valve pumping, or the blood travels through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. Right ventricle goes to the lungs. The left atrium receives the blood, oxygenated blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary vein, or the left atrium is going to pump oxygenated blood down to the left ventricle through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. The left ventricle then will pump blood systemically to the body through the aorta. Okay. And this is going to be that artery system, high pressure artery system. Okay. So that cardiac cycle is the alternative contractions and relaxations of the heart. So think of the lub-dub. Heart rate is a number of heartbeats per minute. We do have like an average, typically an average heart rate, but every person is different. So, it's hard to say 70 to 80 beats a minute is the normal average resting heart rate, but it could change for some individuals. If you're a marathon runner and you run all day, every day, you may have a resting pulse rate of like 50 or 40. Okay. I think Lance Armstrong had something crazy like that. It was like scary slow pulse rate. Okay. So the pulse is a rhythmic stretching of the arteries caused by pressure of blood forced through the arteries by contractions of the ventricles during systole. Okay, so we have systole and diastole, right? So diastole, or is a diastolic pressure, is a stage of the cardiac cycle in which the heart muscle is relaxed, allowing for the chambers to fill with blood. Systole, or systolic pressure, is a contraction stage in which a cardiac cycle, a stage of the cardiac cycle, when the heart chambers actively pump blood. Okay, so diastolic and systolic. So diastolic is going to be that low number when you think of blood pressure, right? That 120/80. The diastolic, or the diastole, is going to be referring to the 80. And that's going to be the millimeters of mercury, the pressure in those arteries, the pressure in your body when your body's at rest. Okay. Systole, or systolic pressure, is going to be that top number, right? So systolic over diastolic, and the systolic pressure is going to be that 120 number, right? That the average number that people typically say. Most people's blood pressure is about 120/80, right? So that systolic pressure is going to be referring to that pressure that's contained in the arteries upon contraction of those ventricles, right? And contraction of the heart. So you have that pressure increase when the heart pumps, right? And that's going to be that excess pressure in comparison to the diastolic, right? It's going to be that pressure from the heart pumping or contracting, okay? So systolic versus diastolic. Systolic's on top, diastolic's on bottom. That's what you kind of need to remember for the exam if I ask you about this, okay? So again, the muscles of the heart relax and diastole, right? And that's going to be the allowing for the blood to kind of rush into the different chambers of the heart. During contraction, the blood is going to be forcing the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves closed, right? And it's going to be the lub dub that you hear, right? The lub is going to be the opening of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, and then the contraction, or that slamming, the lub dub. The dub is going to be from the closing of those valves upon contraction of those ventricles, right? And then we'll see how the heart contracts, but essentially it contracts from atria down and then ventricles up. Okay, so top down, lub dub. So opening of the ventricles, or opening of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves to the ventricles, and then that dub, or that slamming of the valves, is going to be from the ventricles contracting, right? So the atria contract, and then the ventricles contract. Atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles. Okay. So pacemaker is a region of the cardiac muscle located in the wall of the right atrium that maintains the heart's pumping rhythm, so heartbeat, by setting the rate at which the heart contracts. So the heart muscles are very special, right? They do have these gap junctions that allow for electrical signal to be transmitted between the heart tissue or the muscle tissue. Okay, and this is going to be controlled by the pacemaker, right? This pacemaker can send an electrical signal prompting the heart to contract. And remember, the heart muscles, the heart cells will all contract in one nice contraction, right? They're all going to be contracting in unison. That's very important. You don't want the heart to fibrillate, or you don't want the heart to not contract at in one moment, right? Because if they contract at different times, the different heart muscles or the different heart cells, you can have fibrillation, or the shaking of the heart, which is not good. Okay, so here you have the nodes and the pacemaker. Again, that's going to prompt the heart to contract, right? You have the initial start of the pacemaker here. That's going to allow for the atria to contract, and then eventually you have the signal passed to the node here, and then the ventricles will contract. So again, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles. That's going to be important for a proper contraction. An artificial pacemaker is a small electronic device surgically implanted into an individual who does not have a normal heart rate, or has an irregular heart rate, needs to have that heart rate controlled by an artificial pacemaker. Okay, this can control the rhythm of the heart, allowing for the normal rhythm of the heart. Okay, and again, this is going to be shocking and provide some sort of electrical impulse, electrical signal to the heart that allows for proper contractions. Okay. All right, so the structure of the blood vessels. So here we have the smooth muscle, the epithelium, and the connective tissue. That's going to be for the arteries and the veins. Okay. So one of the main things to note between the differences between the artery versus the vein is that arteries are high pressure, veins are low pressure. So veins require this valve or this flap here. Okay. So veins also require a little extra help pumping blood because again they're low pressure. After after the blood passes through a capillary bed, it's going to be low pressure. It's kind of have to pull into a venule and then eventually into a vein. And it requires your muscle, your skeletal muscular system to actually help that vein push the blood back into the heart. Okay. And in order for that low pressure vein to function, you need to have a one-way valve. And this one-way valve is going to prevent blood from pulling back into the vein, again, because the vein is low pressure and you can get pooling of the blood and inappropriate filling of the vein. Okay, and you do require your skeletal muscular system to actually help with this. Okay, so if you have a destruction of the vein or an issue with the vein, so you have the folding or the pulling of blood into your vein, this can be a varicose vein. Okay, or in other parts of the body as well, you can have a hemorrhoid, right? So you can have a hemorrhoid in your anus if you're pushing too hard, or you have large bowel movements again, which will cause this collapse in the valve, and then you have essentially a varicose vein in your anus. Okay, so varicose veins again, this is destruction of the valve, and then hemorrhoids the same thing. You have the pooling of the blood in the vein that's around your rectum or your anus, and then it could fall out or spill out or tear depending on issues that are associated with BMs. So again, you got veins, low pressure. You can have the destruction of the valve, pooling of the blood. Arteries, high pressure. Okay, and it's going to be from that left ventricle that's pumping all that blood at high pressure until it reaches a capillary bed, and then boom, you need help. Okay, so blood flow through the arteries, blood pressure, the force that blood exerts against the walls of the blood vessels. Hypertension, abnormally high blood pressure consisting of a persistent systolic blood pressure higher than 140 millimeters of mercury, or a diastolic pressure higher than 90 millimeters of mercury. This condition can lead to a variety of serious cardiovascular disorders. Excuse me. So again, hypertension, and this is going to be the average systolic pressure over 140 and the average diastolic pressure over 90. Okay. So again, you don't want your blood pressure to be that high. Okay. So gas exchange. So this is showing a capillary and red blood cells. Capillaries are a single red cell thick. And again, they're even sometimes it looks like they're smaller. So the blood can actually fold or be bent as it pumps through the capillary beds. And this warping or this changing or this bending is going to allow for the off gassing as well. Again, because it has to be very, very thin at the capillary bed level. This exchange of gas is going directly to the intersagittal fluid or these cells here. And again, those capillary beds are going to be found systemically throughout the body. Okay, and allow for the oxygen to be off gas. Okay, so here you have tissue, and here you have the artery or the capillary beds, and you have the blood off gassing CO2 and picking up, or off gassing oxygen and picking up CO2. Okay, that will then be transferred out to the lungs where it's off gassed, okay, in exchange for oxygen. Okay, so out goes O2 and in comes CO2 into those capillary beds. Again, this is where you have deoxygenated blood, high CO2 in the veins. Okay, here you have muscles or skeletal muscles that are going to be surrounding the veins. And again, this is why we need to stand up on flights. We need to make sure that your skeletal muscle is helping the blood flow through the veins. Okay, it's going to be pushing the blood through the veins. And again, you don't want this valve to be broken or destroyed or deteriorated because again, you can get the pooling of blood causing a varicose vein to occur. Okay, so you want actively to move during long flights or long drives, again, to help the blood flow back into the superior and inferior vena cava where you can get back to that heart. Okay, so blood, We have plasma. This is a yellowish liquid of the blood in which blood cells are suspended. Red blood cell, a blood cell containing hemoglobin, which transports oxygen, also called a erythrocyte. Hemoglobin and iron containing protein in red blood cells that reversibly binds to O2 and transports it to body tissues. Anemia, a condition in which an abnormally low amount of hemoglobin or low number of red blood cells result in the body cells not receiving enough oxygen. So anemia can be caused by a couple of different things, right? You can either have lack of cells or you can have lack of hemoglobin. And one of the main things about hemoglobin is that the hemoglobin group, there's a peripherin ring system that houses an iron an iron molecule at the center, and that iron molecule is going to essential for binding of oxygen. So if you lack iron in your diet, or you lack iron in your body by some means, either by not absorbing it in your GI system, or you're constantly bleeding, or have a chronic internal bleeding, um, you may be iron deficient and you may have show signs of anemia, right? So there could be either lack of red cells or lack of iron or lack of hemoglobin, okay? And there can also be anemia caused by genetic defects in the hemoglobin as well. So you can have issues with the hemoglobin actually having a normal shape, which can not properly bind to oxygen as efficiently, okay? So one thing about hemoglobin that we need to talk about as well is that, remember, it reversibly binds to oxygen. So oxygen can readily bind and then be transferred off of the hemoglobin, right? You don't want hemoglobin to bind hard or very strongly to oxygen, because then it won't let it go into the surrounding intersagittal fluid. Okay, so you want like a middle ground. You want it to bind reversibly or not as tightly as other things. Okay, all right. So the composition of human blood, again, a majority of it's water, about 44% of it is red cells, and then you have dissolved substances and white cells or platelets, okay? Excuse me. So white blood cell is a blood cell that functions in defending the body against infections, also called leukocytes, and we'll talk about white cells later when we get into the human defense, okay? But white cells are going to be floating around in the blood, okay? So three cellular components of blood. We have the red cells, again, carry oxygen, have hemoglobin. They do not have nuclei, okay? So red cells, RBCs, your erythrocytes, do not have nuclei, okay? Their nuclei is ejected upon release into the blood, okay? Or when they're released into circulation from the bone marrow. White cells, again, they fight infections. You can have, there's different types of white cells in the blood, which we'll talk about later. You have neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils. Um, yeah, there's a lot. So we'll talk about them later. Platelets, again, platelets are cellular components. They're not actually cells. They're going to be secreted by megakaryocytes, and these are going to be secreted from the bone marrow, okay? So again, platelets help produce a clotting protein called fibrin, shown at the bottom, wrapping around a red cell, okay? So here's a clot, fibrin. Again, it's going to be those protein molecules that are kind of linking up together. Platelets and blood clotting. So a platelet is a piece of cytoplasm from a large cell in the bone marrow, a blood clotting element. Fibrogen is going to be a plasma protein that is activated to form a clot. Um, when a blood vessel is injured, fibrin is the activated form of a blood clotting protein, fibrinogen, which aggregates into threads that form a fabric of a blood clot. Okay, so this is going to be like the structure, and then you do have proteins that again activate a clotting event. Okay, cardiovascular disease is a set of diseases of the heart and blood vessels. Coronary artery disease. Our coronary artery is a large blood vessel that conveys blood from the aorta to the tissues of the heart. So we'll see that right now. And atherosclerosis is a cardiovascular disease in which a buildup of fatty deposits called plaque develop into on the inner walls of the arteries, narrowing the passageways through which blood can flow. And we'll see that as well, okay, in a minute. All right, so here we have the coronary artery. or coronary arteries, I should say, and you have these vessels that are going to be feeding the heart with blood. Okay, and you can see here they branch from the aorta. Remember, the aorta um, gets oxygenated blood directly from the left ventricle, so this is a primary source of blood flow, right? So the arteries are branching from the aorta and feeding the heart systemically. Okay, so here. At the lower edge of the heart, you do have a blockage, which can prevent the blood flow. Okay, there's a few ways that this can be. Um, there's a few ways that this can be repaired. Either you can have a stent, which is placed inside of the artery, which can then open that passageway up and allow blood to flow, or you can have what is called a bypass, right? So you've heard of individuals receiving a bypass, and this is essentially what exactly how it sounds. There's a piece of artery that's sewn into the top above the blockage and sewn at the bottom, which allows for the blood to flow or bypass that blockage. Okay, which I don't think is as efficient. This stent seems like a much more efficient way, but I'm not a surgeon or a cardiologist. I have no idea which is better, which is more healthy. But they've been doing bypasses for a lot longer than they've had the stents. Okay, the stents require endoscopic procedure where they go in and actually push through an artery until they get to that blockage. Okay, so here's a normal artery that is not atherosclerotic. So here, there's no blockage. You have clear blood flow. Here, you have a blockage or partially blocked artery, and you see the plaque forming, um, and block eventually, which will form and block the entire artery if you do have a 100% blockage. So they will rate your blockages based on percentages. Okay, you have like a 50 or 40% blockage, and they'll tell you, hey, you gotta shape it up and get on cholesterol medication or other types of medications that are lower this atherosclerotic event. Um, and yeah, or they'll perform surgery. So here you have a stent versus a bypass. So a stent again is going to be endoscopic. It's going to go through the artery. You're going to have to push through that blockage, open up that blockage with a balloon, and then you have the stent that's left in the artery. Okay. And there can be some complications associated with this, right? If the stent breaks down, if you have an allergic reaction or reaction to the stent tissue or the stent material, there's a few different things that can occur. The stent can be displaced, or it can move up into the artery or lower into the artery, allowing for that blockage to form. You can have blockages form above or below the stent after. So yeah, there's a few different things that can be problematic with this. But bypass, same thing. There can be issues here too, right? But you do have a new artery that's cut into, or that's sewn into the artery. I've heard of a couple of different types of tissues or different types of tubes being used for the bypass. So, um, well, I had a friend that did research on this, so I guess I should mention it because I know, I guess, a little bit about it. But so in bypass surgery, sometimes they don't always use a vein from the leg. Sometimes they take uh, from the internal mammary artery. So the internal mammary artery actually feeds the breast tissue or the mammary gland, and it breaks off early on from, I don't know exactly where it's from. My anatomy is pretty bad, so I don't think it's not from the aorta. It could be from the subclavian artery, but it's a branch away from directly from the heart, really close to the heart. And it turns out that that artery actually has anti atherosclerotic capability, so it actually doesn't form plaque as readily as other types of blood vessels. So they usually take from there as well. So the internal mammary artery, but it can be a vein or another artery from a different part of the body as well, right? So getting into respiration, animal respiration. So unifying concepts of animal respiration. Remember, C6H12O6 gets broken down with through cellular respiration with aid of oxygen to make 6 carbon dioxide, water, and energy, right? And this is why we breathe. We need to breathe in oxygen in order to breathe out CO2 upon breakdown of the carbon molecules. Okay, remember the citric acid cycle and the removal of those CO2s. This is important. This is why we breathe. Okay. So the diversity of respiratory organs. Um, so some respiratory organs are external, so skin and gills, and some are internal, such as a trachea and lungs. Okay, so the leech does have respiratory surfaces on the surface of their skin, just like amphibians. Okay, so they can off gas or exchange oxygen through their tissue or the surface of their skin. Gills in the sea slug, again, you have the off gassing, the exchange in their gills, right? In this mollusk or slug. Trachea systems are a little bit different, and they're kept in bugs and arthropods. Or sorry, not arthropods. Well, yeah, arthropods. So insects, arachnids, things like that will have trachea as well. Um, but trachea are important for the development of modern day uh, um, bugs. Okay, so the thing with these organisms, especially um, with like ants, spiders, beetles, right? This tracheal system limits the size, the maximum size of how large these organisms can be. Okay. Again, they don't have a sufficient surface area that allows for them to be much larger. Okay. Right. An elephant can be that large because it has an advanced circulatory system and an advanced pulmonary system. Right. You'll never get a bug that's larger than about 13 inches. Okay. And that is the limit. That is pushing it to the absolute limit. And it's limited because you have this tracheal system, right? The ability for this organism to exchange gases is very limited when in terms of, and it'll limit how large that organism will be, right? Um, because again, if you get too large, this system becomes inefficient, right? You have so much cells, you have so much tissue you need to feed with oxygen and off gas of CO2 that you're limited to the size that you're able to be. Okay. And the size is about 13 inches or smaller. Okay. I mean, the bugs can still be quite huge. You've seen some giant spiders or giant arachnids or arthropods, but or other organisms that are bugs, but or insects, but you don't see them get that large. You don't see them get as large as what you see in the ancient eras of evolution, right? Where you see giant dragonflies that are massive. Okay, and that you just don't see anymore. Okay, again, because the oxygen back then, during early Earth or early developmental Earth, had higher oxygen levels. Okay. All right, so lungs and us, animals, they have sacs, and they have alveolar or respiratory surfaces. Okay, so human respiratory system, breathing, the ventilation of lungs by alternate inhalation and exhalation supply a lung or a gill with O2 rich air or water and expelling CO2 rich air or water. So lung or gill. Okay. So here you have, again, showing you the hiker breathing in oxygen, off-gassing CO2, which is from respiration or breakdown of glucose. Um, Here you have the exchange of oxygen and CO2 in the capillary beds and the intersagittal fluid. Again, the mitochondria do need oxygen in order to perform respiration for the cells. Okay. So the path of air, you have a pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. Okay, so pharynx is the organ in the digestive tract that receives food from the oral cavity. In terrestrial vertebrates, the throat region is where the air and food passages cross. Okay, so you have the epiglottis that closes or opens depending on whether or not you're breathing or swallowing. Okay, you have the larynx. This is a voice box containing vocal cords. Trachea, the windpipe, the portion of the respiratory tube between the larynx and the bronchi. Okay, and we'll see that right now. You have the bronchus, which is one pair of the branching tubes that branch from the trachea into the lungs. Okay, alveoli, one of the millions of tiny sacs within the vertebrate lungs where gas exchange occurs. Okay, so here you have the breathing or inhalation. Here you have the tracheal system, and then eventually branches off into the bronchioles. You can't see the bronchioles here because they're covered by the lungs and the rib cage. Um, and this is also showing you the contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm. Okay, so diaphragm contracts, so it pulls the lungs down or open, As it relaxes, the lungs go back and release the air. You do have a specific tidal volume that is in the lungs, right? And you do have 3 lobes of the lung on the right side, whereas on the left side you have 2. And again, this is going to be the anatomy. This is the anatomy of the heart getting in the way of the lung development here. Again, anatomy supports the physiology. You need a little more space on the left side of the chest in order to have the proper fitting of the heart. Okay. Um, we don't really need to talk about this, but it's important. I guess it's important to know. So breathing control centers, you can control your breathing, right? You can control the skeletal muscles, right? The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle. You can control it, right? The 2 muscles you can't control, your heart and your smooth muscle, which is found in the GI tract, and your veins and arteries. Okay, but you can't control those. You can control, again, your diaphragm, your skeletal muscular system. But your primitive brain, your pons, your medulla allow for that control naturally, right? You don't have to think about breathing to breathe, right? You don't have to stop while you're eating and be like, oh shoot, I have to breathe, right? Because this is controlled by the brain stem, right? And this is like the primitive brain or the early brain, or they call it the reptilian brain, because reptiles typically have a very small brain. They typically have this developed brain stem here rather than the full nice brain that we as humans have developed. Okay. But here's where we control the breathing, right? And it's just normal without having to think about breathing. Okay. All right. So here we have the blood showing blood or gas exchange in the lungs or the capillaries of the lungs. So this is the alveolus or an air sac. Again, these air sacs are tiny. They can be readily damaged. So typically what you see with individuals with damaged air sacs, they can develop different pathologies such as COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And again, you typically see this with individuals that have smoked or that are overweight. So sometimes you'll see a lot of overweight patients with COPD, again, because of the pressure that's put on their lungs. Okay. So you can damage these air sacs again if you have too high of pressure, high blood pressure. Um, yeah. So here it's just showing the gas exchange. But again, this sac is very sensitive, right? And remember the right ventricle pumps blood directly to the lung, where it comes back to the left atrium, and that left ventricle then pumps it throughout the whole body, and then vice versa, right? You have your pulmonary system and your systemic system. Remember, the pulmonary system is going to the lungs. Okay. So here you have an artery, and it's showing the red cells. So each red cell contains 250 million molecules of hemoglobin. So that's a lot of hemoglobin for one red cell. So the job of the red cells essentially is to carry oxygen to different parts of the body and off gas that oxygen into the intersagittal fluid so you can have respiration occur swimmingly. Okay. So here's a heme group. So this is one hemoglobin molecule. So you have 4 iron groups associated with one hemoglobin molecule, and that oxygen is going to be housed right in the middle. Okay. So again, this is a protein with the iron heme group, and again, it's going to be housing the oxygen directly in the center of that hemoglobin molecule. So it's important to know that oxygen, remember, as I mentioned earlier, is readily bound and unbound from hemoglobin, right? You need a level of specificity to hemoglobin, but not that specific, right? You don't want oxygen to bind to hemoglobin, not be removed, right? Oops. So you don't want oxygen to bind to this heme molecule and not get removed, okay? The issue with carbon monoxide and why carbon monoxide is so toxic and so poisonous to humans is because that it binds to this hemoglobin group here, and it binds here and it does not want to let go. And carbon monoxide, so CO, binds to this group or this hemoglobin group very, very, very strongly. Okay, and this is why if you leave your car in your garage, or sometimes you have individuals that attempt suicide this way, is very, very effective. Okay, because again, you can breathe in this carbon monoxide and essentially you have carbon monoxide poisoning. And it binds to your hemoglobin. Therefore, you have the inability to have oxygen bound to the hemoglobin anymore. So you've heard of many cases where in resort towns they actually don't. Some of them are quite impoverished still. They don't have access. They just choose not to have carbon monoxide detectors because they are expensive, right? So carbon monoxide detectors again will alarm or set the alarm if there is a carbon monoxide leak, and this can be from a gas or overburning or some sort of fuel that's lynching into the into that room or that home. Again, this is going to prevent individuals from again dying in their sleep because carbon monoxide is odorless. It binds to the hemoglobin group insolubly, so it does not get removed, and then the individual will lack enough oxygen to be dispersed throughout the body. Okay, so again, carbon monoxide hijacks hemoglobin in your blood, displacing oxygen, and essentially what it means is it's binding to that hemoglobin group tighter than oxygen can bind, so it won't be removed. It won't be off exchanged. Okay. All right. Any questions? No. Okay. Well, I do have office hours right now. So if you want to attend, please come. I'll try to get this uploaded as soon as possible. That way, everyone can start their labs. Okay. But if not, I will see you all tomorrow.